a suitcase that's never been opened, and a truth someone died to hide. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I'm your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love reading every comment. Now let's begin. It had been raining since the previous evening, a fine, insistent drizzle that blurred the outlines of the street lamps and made the air smell faintly of wet stone. The droplets traced a slow path down the tall window of Maigret's office, gathering at the bottom in a small pool that trembled whenever a tram passed along the boulevard. It was Saturday morning, the kind that rarely brought real police work, only the kind of domestic complaints and drunken quarrels best handled by the night sergeant. Maigret sat in his chair, coat still on, pipe between his teeth but unlit. He wasn't thinking of work. His mind kept drifting back to the promise he had made Madame Maigret, to be home early enough for lunch. She was making choucroute and had insisted on finding the proper sausages from a butcher she liked in the Rue de la Harpe. There was a comfort in that thought, in the image of the kitchen window misting over while she fussed at the stove. It kept him from paying much attention to the occasional shuffle of papers from the corridor or the muffled clatter from the typing room. The knock, when it came, was hesitant, not the brisk rap of an inspector or the impatient pounding of someone with an urgent case. It was a damp sound, 3 knuckles on wood, almost apologetic. "Come in," Maigret said without moving. A uniformed constable stepped in, cap under his arm. His boots left small wet prints on the floorboard. "There's a man, Chief. Says he doesn't want to bother you, but, well, he's been waiting downstairs since 8. Claims he's from Montrouge, a Sipège." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "And?" The constable shifted uncomfortably. "He's carrying a suitcase. Says he hasn't opened it since last night. He insists you should see it." It was the sort of thing Maigret might have waved away on another morning, but something in the way the constable avoided his eyes, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps unease, made him curious. People carried suitcases every day. They didn't usually sit in a police station lobby, guarding one for hours in the rain. Maigret stood, adjusting his hat, and followed the constable down the stairs. The station smelled faintly of damp wool and cheap tobacco. The shoemaker was exactly as described. A small, wiry man in his 50s, his hair plastered to his skull from the weather. His brown suit had gone shiny at the elbows, and his shoes, naturally, were immaculate, buffed to a dull glow. The suitcase rested on the floor beside him. It was old but sturdy, the leather darkened from years of handling, the brass lock dulled with age. When Maigret approached, the man looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed but not from drink. "Monsieur le commissaire," he said, his voice low and deliberate. I think there is something you should know, but I cannot bring myself to open it." Maigret didn't ask what was inside. He simply gestured toward the small interview room off the lobby. The man picked up the suitcase, carefully, as if it contained glass, and followed. Inside, the rain tapped faintly against the single window. Maigret closed the door and sat across from him. "You can tell me your name first," he said. "Armand Jurel. I have a shop on Rue Frion. Since my father died, I've worked alone." He hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the suitcase as if it were a third presence in the room. "Yesterday evening, I found it in my workshop, and I know it was not there when I closed for lunch." The clock in the corridor ticked steadily. Maigret leaned back, letting the silence do its work. Jurel's fingers tightened on the handle. "It is not mine," the shoemaker said at last, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I'm afraid of what is in it." Maigret's eyes rested on the old, unopened case. He had seen hundreds like it over the years. In railway compartments, in lost property offices, in attics where dust lay thick enough to swallow the labels. Most open to nothing more than folded clothes or forgotten papers. But there was a stillness in the room now, a weight that did not come from the leather or the lock. Outside, the drizzle showed no sign of stopping. Somewhere far away, Madame Maigret's choucroute would be beginning to simmer. Maigret reached for his pipe. He still didn't light it. Maigret let the silence hold a few beats longer, as if to see whether the suitcase would speak for itself, then rose with a small sigh and tapped ash from a match he hadn't struck. The shoemaker watched his hands rather than his face. When Maigret reached for the case, Jorel put out a hurried palm, a reflex that made him flush. "Leave it closed," Maigret said gently. "For now." He sent the constable to fetch a car, not because Montrouge required ceremony, but to avoid the shoemaker carrying his burden on the tram under other people's eyes. While they waited under the glazed canopy, rain threaded the air in a steady grey. It was the sort that didn't drum or wash, only insisted. The shoemaker held his hat in front of him and looked at its lining as if counting stitches. Maigret thought of the kitchen at Boulevard Richelieu-Lenoir, the choucroute fattening slowly, and called home from the desk sergeant's telephone. He put on the voice he used for bad weather. "I'll be late," he told his wife. "Don't keep it on the stove." "I never do," she answered. She didn't ask why. He pictured her eyes lifting toward the window, reading the rain for its own news. In the car, the suitcase sat between them on the rear bench like an obedient animal. The driver threaded south along the Boulevard Raspail and into streets where the buildings crouched lower and the gutters carried ribbons of brown. The shoemaker pointed once, unnecessarily. Maigret had been down Rue Frion in other years on other errands, and the corner cafe with the zinc counter hadn't changed except for the hand-painted sign advertising a lottery. It was a neighborhood where people used each other's first names in the mornings and closed shutters early. The shop's window was a single pane, squared by a net of faint scratches. Inside were wooden lasts, a pyramid of shoe-polished tins, a line of soles like skins hung to dry. Above the door was a bell on a spring. It trembled at their arrival and fell still. Damp rose from the floor, carrying the sweetly sour smell of glue and leather dust. On the workbench, an iron awl lay skewed from where a hand had left it in haste. A chair stood too far from the bench, as if it had been pushed back by knees that didn't belong. "Show me," Maigret said. Jorel placed the suitcase on a battered stool by the counter, then stepped back and clasped his wrists as if to keep them from trembling. "I keep the door open in the mornings," he said. "I closed for lunch from 12 to 1. I eat at Madame Rousseau's. When I returned, it was here. No note." "Front door locked?" "Yes. I always turn the key twice. It is a habit my father had." "And the back?" Maigret nodded toward a narrow corridor behind the bead curtain. "There is a door to the courtyard," the shoemaker admitted. "Only a latch. It sticks in winter and loosens in summer." Maigret went to see. The corridor had a line of nails where aprons hung like spent flags. One peg was empty, the dust clean in a small circle the size of a pocket watch. He tried the back latch with his thumb. It resisted, then yielded with a weary click. The brick of the yard beyond was slick with algae. A drain gurgled faintly. On the left, a set of steps climbed to the first-floor landing where a grey shawl hung over the railing to dry. He let the door fall back and returned to the shop without speaking. Silence did not make people more comfortable. It made them feel it. The shoemaker's eyes traveled from the bench to the window and back to the suitcase. "I did not want to involve the police," he said at last. "But I could not bring myself." "No," Maigret said. "Of course." He ran a thumb along the suitcase's handle. The leather was dry as old bread, cracked at the bend. A flake came away and showed a paler skin beneath. Near the lock, a sliver of thread had caught, grey-blue, finer than the thread stitched in the shoemaker's apron. Women's thread, the kind used for lining rather than soles. And there, on the corner, the ghost of a sticker that had been scraped, only a sliver of gummed paper remaining with 2 letters. T.E. It could have been anything. Hotel, Something. But the angle of the tear suggested it had been done in haste, thumb worrying, impatient. You smoke? He asked. Never in the shop, no. Jarrell sounded almost offended. A tray on the counter held 3 finished shoes with tickets pinned by thread. One ticket was gone, the thread snipped and left curled like a question mark. What is missing? Maigret asked, but mildly, as if remarking on the weather. The shoemaker frowned, then moved to the tray and counted with his lips. 46, 48, 47. He looked up. A pair of ladies' half boots. For Madame Roche upstairs. She has trouble with her ankles. Maigret walked to the window and looked out at the street. In the cafe opposite, a woman with red hair, too carefully set for the hour, stared into a mirror behind the bottles and adjusted the collar of her cardigan. A boy ran past with a newspaper held over his head, the rain making freckles of ink on his cheeks. A man in a brown hat smoked under an awning, the smoke caught by the drizzle and made to hang low. Ordinary life, all of it. He turned back. You did not mention a Madame Roche. The shoemaker's mouth opened and closed. I did not think it mattered. She pays cash. She leaves her shoes by the door with a note because she is shy about her feet. The back latch, Maigret said. Everyone in the building knows it sticks? Everyone who has lived here long enough, the shoemaker conceded. It was my father's shop before mine. Maigret stepped behind the counter. The floorboards creaked in a voice they kept for strangers. There was a small dark circle near the stool, faint but not invisible, a spot of moisture that had dried at the edges before the center, like a ring left by a wet cup. He crouched, put one finger to the wood. It came away clean. Around it, the swept dust had made arcs that stopped before the legs of the stool, as a broom would when skirting an obstacle. The suitcase, then, had sat long enough to be circled, but not long enough for the mark to vanish. From the street, the bell sounded again. A woman in a rain hood entered with shoulders gathered up to her ears. She gave a start when she saw the unfamiliar man in a hat behind the counter. I only came to ask if my heels... Oh. She looked at the shoemaker, then at the suitcase as if it were a person. I can come back. Madame Rousseau, the shoemaker said quickly, relieved. This is... Never mind names, Maigret said, not unkindly. Does the gentleman eat at your place? Everyone eats at my place, she replied, with the humor of the proprietor who must bear them all. Yesterday he had sausage and puree. He left his fork in the wrong place, as usual. She dimpled at the shoemaker, who looked down. Between 12 and 1, Maigret said. Did anyone ask after him? Anyone unusual? Unusual? In the rain? Only the usual men who stay too long with their coffee because their wives heat the soup too hot. A thin fellow I didn't know stood under my awning the whole time, smoking and not coming in. He had a hat you see in catalogues, not in life. Shiny. He watched the shop across the street, but I thought he looked at the young man who sweeps for the barber. If he watched the shop, then he wastes his time. Armand locks at noon like the Angelus. Did he look at the upstairs windows? Maigret asked. At everything, she said, the way a cold does, getting into every corner. When she left, the room seemed smaller. Outside, she stopped to exchange a sentence with the man in the brown hat. He did not take a cigarette from his lips while answering. Maigret took the suitcase by its handle and felt its weight. More than empty clothes, less than books. A soft weight, not rattling. It made a sound like a folded thing settling when he shifted it. He set it down again. Madame Roche? He asked. She is a widow, Jarrell said. She rarely goes out. She used to teach catechism. Since her niece left for Dijon, she has no one. She always apologizes for her ankles. And 47? I meant to deliver them this afternoon. We will go up, Maigret said. The stairs smelled of dust and onions. On the landing, a rubber plant drooped with the patience of an invalid. Madame Roche answered to a gentle knock with the quiet of someone who listens before opening. She had the kind of face that had been pretty before a certain age made it transparent. You could see the girl and the tired woman occupying it together. She looked at the shoemaker, then at Maigret's hat, and stood back at once. "My shoes aren't ready," she said, then flushed. I'm sure they are." "Come in, if you must." Her sitting room had 2 chairs and a little table with a crocheted cloth protected by glass. On the mantel stood a framed photograph of a soldier from another war, too upright to be at ease. The window overlooked the yard. There was a tea stain on the sill. "You heard anything at midday?" Maigret asked, as if asking about the rain. "In the corridor, the yard." "I sleep after soup," she said. "The doctor says it is good for women who can't keep food, but—" She looked at her hands. "The latch. It clicks like a tongue when it's opened. I heard that, and the bell did not ring. Armand has a way of letting the air out of the shop when he comes back. It smells of leather for a moment, and then he is there, humming. Yesterday, when I woke, there was only the latch and then nothing. But I could hear the rain. Oh, you will laugh at me. Smelling of violets." "Violets?" The shoemaker, startled, spoke before Maigret could. "The powder," she said quickly, embarrassed by the poetry of her nose. "Women who work at counters sometimes use it. Something old-fashioned. It clings when the air is damp." "Do you know a woman who comes to the shop?" Maigret asked. "Not a customer." "You are thinking of the niece," she said, hopeful to be helpful. "But she is in Dijon and wears boots for farms. Armand is a good man. He does not look up from his work." Back in the corridor, the shoemaker whispered, "She is kind to me with her gossip. It makes the day shorter." Maigret did not smile. On the landing, he paused to touch the railing where the shawl had been soaked and now was only damp. He pressed his thumb and forefinger and brought them apart slowly. A faint grey came away, not lint, not dust, the talc of some cheap powder that the rain had turned to a paste. He wiped it on his handkerchief and put it away. On the ground floor again, the bells sang them into the street. The rain had grown finer still, so the air felt furred. The man in the brown hat had gone. In the cafe, the red-haired woman lit a cigarette and extinguished it at once, as if the gesture were the point. On the shoemaker's bench, the all waited. The suitcase did not look larger or smaller. It had that gravity only certain objects acquire when they begin to hold other people's time. Inspector Lognon arrived then, shoulders hunched, the shoulders of a man who believes weather chooses him. He stood in the doorway and took the situation in with disappointment. "So," he said, "a suitcase." "Unopened," Maigret said. Lognon looked at the ceiling as if asking whether it must always be him. "We have burglaries that are actually burglaries," he offered, more in defense of himself than of the city. "We have a man who steals only umbrellas. He will not steal hats. There is some principle. This—" he made a little gesture at the case. "Someone placed it here between 12 and 1, Maigret said. "By the back. They scraped a sticker from it recently. They left a trace a woman would leave if she were careless. They watched from the cafe or from the awning to see whether it would be noticed. One pair of shoes is missing its ticket. Tell me which of these things is nothing." Lognon pursed his lips until they whitened. "It could be laundry," he said, stubborn as a mule. "People leave laundry in places they mistake." "People leave laundry in a shoemaker's?" Maigret asked without sarcasm. "Would you?" Lognon lifted his raincoat and sat on the chair too far from the bench. He took out a notebook and did not open it. "You will open it," he said, resigned to theatre. "Not yet." Maigret's voice was almost tender. "We will let it wait a little longer, enough for whoever placed it to wonder whether the shoemaker has opened it on his own, enough for them to lose the courage they had when they watched from the awning and perhaps to come back, to press a note under the door, to telephone. Sometimes you catch a fish by stirring the water. Sometimes you catch it by letting the rain do that for you." He stood near the window again, letting the pain chill his sleeve. Across the street, Madame Rousseau wiped the mirror with a cloth, then looked at herself, dissatisfied. The neighborhood settled around them, accepting the presence of the case as it accepts a new old man on a bench, by glancing and then deciding to ignore. In the yard, the latch made a tiny sound and held. Maigret felt the old certainty that was not reason and not a hunch, only the pressure behind the eyes when something in a room is wrong because someone in a life is wrong. The suitcase did not belong to the shoemaker's story. It had been imported from another, dropped here because this was a place where people were used to mending what they could and living with what they could not. He filled his pipe and did not light it. "We will wait," he said, "and we will ask the barber's boy and the red-haired woman and the postman and the man in the shiny hat, if he comes again, what they think they did not see. Meanwhile, you will not touch the case. You will work as if nothing has changed. Give Madame Roche her 47 before evening. If someone speaks to you, listen twice." The shoemaker nodded, imperfectly reassured. "And if no one comes?" "Someone always comes," Maigret said. He could taste just then the faint sweetness in the damp as if the air had brushed past a woman's neck. He filed the detail away with the crack in the handle and the missing ticket and the way the chair had been pushed back by knees that knew work. The rain continued, polite and steady, as if it had all the time in the world. The rain thinned toward evening, but it didn't stop. It was the sort of drizzle that had patience, that could outlast anyone waiting for a clearing. Maigret stayed in the shoemaker's shop longer than he had intended, moving between the counter, the window, and the back door in no particular order, as if he were a customer unable to decide on a purchase. The suitcase sat where it had been left, its presence beginning to feel less like an object and more like a quiet lodger in the room. The street outside kept shifting in small ways. The red-haired woman in the cafe changed her seat twice, as though seeking a better view or a warmer draft. The barber's boy appeared with a broom, pushing at the wet pavement without conviction. A delivery cart rolled by, the horse's hooves splashing in slow rhythm. And once, for a moment, too brief to be sure, a man in a shiny hat paused under Madame Rousseau's awning, the brim tilted low so his face was no more than a pale suggestion. When Maigret moved toward the door, the man had already turned the corner. He didn't mention it to Lognon. The inspector had taken to tapping his pencil on his notebook, producing no notes, only a small, persistent sound. The shoemaker, meanwhile, kept glancing at the clock above the door as if it might deliver him from the uncertainty. At last he said, "I should take Madame Roche her shoes. You told me." "Yes," Maigret agreed. "Go." The shoemaker's relief was visible in the way his shoulders dropped. He wrapped the pair in brown paper with a neatness that came from years of habit, tied the string twice around, and left through the front door. Maigret watched him cross the street, disappearing into the building's entrance. A minute later, the bell over the shop door gave a tiny quiver. Not enough to have been opened fully, just the faint complaint of the spring. He stepped behind the counter, looked toward the back. The latch on the yard door was down, but the bead curtains swayed once as if someone had brushed past it. He walked to the corridor. The air had that faint sweetness again, the powdery scent Madame Roche had mentioned. On the ground near the door was a half-moon of damp, like the print of a shoe that had only grazed the floor. It was already blurring as the wood drank it in. He stepped into the yard and looked up. The shawl on the railing was gone. A window above stood ajar by the width of 2 fingers. By the time he returned to the front, the shoemaker was back, unwrapping the empty string from his fingers. "She was pleased," he said, almost defensively. Maigret nodded. "Good." He didn't tell him about the movement in the back. Sometimes it was better to keep a small thing in one's pocket until it had ripened into something larger. The evening settled in layers. Lights came on in the apartments above, casting rectangles onto the wet cobbles. The smell of frying onions drifted from somewhere near the cafe. A tram clanged faintly in the distance, and then the telephone rang, a blunt, heavy sound in the quiet shop. The shoemaker started, but Maigret lifted the receiver before he could move. "Jorels," Maigret said. There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then a woman's voice, low and unsteady, said, "Tell him not to open it." The words were followed by the soft click of the line going dead. He replaced the receiver slowly. The shoemaker's mouth opened, but no words came. "Who was it?" he asked at last. "Someone who prefers it remain unopened," Maigret said. "Do you recognize the voice?" The shoemaker shook his head too quickly. "Number no. I don't speak to many women, not on the telephone." The lie was gentle but transparent, like thin cloth over a lamp. Maigret let it pass. He moved to the window again, but the street offered no face that fit the voice. Only the usual. The barber's boy now idling at the cafe door, Madame Rousseau wiping down a table, a postman swinging his bag onto the counter to sign for a parcel. When he turned back, Lognon was watching him with the dour satisfaction of someone who thinks a prediction is about to come true. "You see, a prank. They'll collect it when you've had enough of your waiting." Maigret didn't answer. He was thinking about the voice, how it had trembled not with fear, but with urgency. Not "don't" as a plea, more as a warning. The hours between 7 and 9 passed in small increments. Customers came for their shoes, and the shoemaker worked as if each stitch might disguise the presence of the suitcase. Once, a man in a wet overcoat entered, looked around as though uncertain where he was, then left without a word. At 8:45, Maigret told the shoemaker to close up. "Same as every night," he said. "No special precautions. Leave the case there." They stepped out together, Maigret lighting his pipe at last. The night air had a chill edge, the rain now so fine it was almost mist. The shoemaker locked the front door with the same double turn he had described earlier, tested it, and looked up and down the street before heading toward his lodgings around the corner. Maigret lingered under the awning of the cafe. He ordered a beer and sat near the window, the case's silhouette faintly visible through the shop's front glass. Across the way, the building entrances became doorways of light for a moment as residents came and went. He waited, watched. The beer grew warm. At 9:30, movement. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadow beside the barber's, crossed the street quickly, and crouched at the shoemaker's door. Maigret didn't move. The figure tried the handle. Once, twice, then straightened. It was a man, medium height, wearing a hat that caught the light in a sheen. He looked up at the apartment windows, then down the street, and slipped into the narrow space between the shoemaker's building and the one next to it. Maigret set down his glass and crossed the street at an ordinary pace. The gap between the buildings smelled of damp stone. Halfway along was the yard door. It stood ajar, the latch loose. He stepped inside, careful not to disturb the shadows. The smell of violets was stronger here, mingled with the metallic tang of wet iron. From the back of the shop came a faint sound, the click of brass against brass. He moved closer, each step slow. Through the bead curtain, he saw the man crouched over the suitcase, working at the lock with a key that didn't quite fit. The man's shoulders were tense, his breath quick. "Evening," Maigret said quietly. The man froze, then rose slowly, turning to reveal a face lined deeper than its age warranted. The shiny hat was indeed the catalogue kind, cheap, trying for style. He forced a smile that didn't hold. "I thought Armand asked me." "No," Maigret said. For a moment, the man's hand hovered over the suitcase handle, as if weighing whether to snatch it and run. Then he stepped back. "I only wanted to see if it was still here." "It is," Maigret said, "and it will be until I decide otherwise." The man shifted from foot to foot, then nodded once and brushed past him into the yard. Maigret let him go, listening to his steps fade toward the street. When he returned to the front, the case was still on the stool, untouched. He sat beside it, pipe smoke curling in the air, and thought about the two visitors it had attracted today. One voice on the telephone, one man in the shadows, both connected by a scent that did not belong to leather or glue, both anxious not about what might be found, but about the moment it would be found. Somewhere above, a window closed softly. By the time he left the shop, the rain had stopped altogether. The street glistened under the lamps, and the air held that clean, hollow quiet that follows a long, wet day. He walked without hurry toward the corner where the tram rails curved away, already knowing he would return in the morning. The case could wait, but the people circling it, knowingly or not, were beginning to show themselves, and once they did, they rarely drifted far. The next morning was the kind Paris sometimes produced in early spring, when the rain had washed the air but left the streets pale and slick. The gutters still carried a thin ribbon of water, and the paving stones reflected the milk-white sky. Maigret arrived in Montrouge earlier than he had told the shoemaker he would, walking the last few streets rather than taking the car. He preferred the quiet tread of his shoes on the damp stones, the faint sound of water dripping from awnings, the way the neighborhood was still half asleep. The shop's front shutters were down, the metal damp under his fingers when he touched them. He didn't knock. Instead, he went round to the yard, where the latch yielded easily again. The bead curtain hung still. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polish. The suitcase was where it had been, waiting with that patient, mute confidence of an object whose purpose was to unsettle. He heard the shoemaker's steps from the stairs above. Jarrell descended in his shirt sleeves, hair combed but still wet from washing. He looked more tired than the day before, the kind of tiredness that came from thinking in circles through the night. "I didn't touch it," he said without greeting. "I didn't think you would," Maigret replied. They opened the front shutters together, the hinges giving a soft complaint. The street was beginning to move. Bakers' boys on bicycles, a woman with a basket for the market, a tram clanging 2 streets away. Across the road, Madame Rousseau stepped outside her cafe to sweep the pavement. She glanced over once, then again, her eyes flicking toward the shop's interior. "Who's she watching for?" Maigret asked, almost to himself. Jarrell looked up. "She sees everything. It's a habit." "People with habits also have preferences," Maigret murmured, but let the thought rest. Around mid-morning, he left the shop and crossed to the cafe. Madame Rousseau was behind the counter, polishing cups that didn't need polishing. She smiled quickly when she saw him, then busied herself with the coffee pot. "Quiet street," he said. "It has to be." "People work here," she replied. "You noticed the man last night," he said, watching her face. She kept her eyes on the cups. "I noticed someone in a hat. Not the kind of hat you keep in the rain unless you're hiding the face under it." "Did he come in?" "Number?" He waited outside the barber's. Smoked too fast. She put down the cup and looked at him properly now. "You think it's trouble?" "I think trouble usually wears a hat," Maigret said. When he returned to the shop, Lognon was already there, arms folded, his coat collar turned up like a man standing in a draft. "The lock on that case is cheap," he said by way of greeting. "Anyone could force it." "Yes," Maigret said. "And yet no one has." Lognon's mouth thinned. "Except the fellow you scared off last night." "Even he only tried a key," Maigret reminded him. The morning passed in the slow rhythm of cobbler's work. The tap of a hammer on a heel, the rasp of a file, the occasional creak of leather. Customers came and went. Some glanced at the case, others didn't notice. It was just before noon, as Jarrell was tying off a stitch, that the telephone rang again. Maigret picked it up. Silence first, then the same woman's voice, quicker this time and lower. "He'll ruin himself if you open it." "He doesn't know." "Who?" Maigret asked. But the line had already gone dead. He stayed still for a moment, the receiver heavy in his hand, then replaced it. Jarell was looking at him with an expression somewhere between curiosity and dread. Was it? Yes, Maigret said. She thinks you don't know something. The shoemaker shook his head, but there was no conviction in it. His hands returned to the leather, working more quickly than before. At a little after 2, a boy from the barber's slipped into the shop. He had a grin that didn't belong to his age, the grin of someone who'd been listening at doors. "You looking for the man with the hat?" he asked Maigret. "Maybe." He was back this morning. Talked to the red-haired lady at the cafe before she went upstairs. Then he stood in the yard, like he was waiting. Didn't knock. "Which red-haired lady?" Maigret asked, though he already knew. "She lives 2 doors down. Says she sells gloves in the center, but she's always here." The boy grinned again, proud of his information. "Want me to watch for him?" "No," Maigret said. "I'll watch." The boy left, and Maigret stepped to the window. Across the street, the red-haired woman was visible through her curtain for a moment, fastening something at her neck. Her movements were quick, as if she'd been interrupted. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of old linen, the kind that doesn't dry properly indoors. Maigret told Jarell he was going out and walked 2 streets over to a tobacconist where he could see the cafe without being seen. He bought matches he didn't need and stood in the doorway, pipe in hand. The man in the shiny hat appeared just after 5. He came from the tram stop, glancing back once as though making sure he wasn't followed. He passed the cafe, then circled back and leaned on the counter inside. The red-haired woman emerged from the back, said something, and they both looked toward the shoemaker's. Their talk was brief. She shook her head sharply. He shrugged, and then he left. She watched him go before turning her gaze to the shop again. When Maigret returned, Lognon was gone, leaving only the smell of his cigarettes. Jarell was mending a child's sandal, his hands steady but his mouth tight. "You have enemies?" Maigret asked. "Shoemakers don't have enemies," Jarell said. "Then you have someone else's," Maigret said. He saw the flicker in the shoemaker's eyes before the man lowered them. "You're imagining." "No," Maigret said simply. "I don't imagine much." It was nearly closing time when the postman arrived with a small envelope. No stamp, no return address. He handed it over without ceremony. Jarell looked at it, then at Maigret, as if asking permission to open his own mail. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. In careful block letters it read, "Leave it in the yard tonight. Alone." Jarell's hands shook slightly as he passed it over. "If I do, then we see who comes for it," Maigret said. "And if you don't, they may come anyway." That night they left the shop dark, but the yard door unlatched. Maigret and Lognon waited in the small apartment above, the light out, the window overlooking the yard. Jarell sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on nothing. The suitcase was visible below, a squat shadow on the flagstones. The street quieted. The last tram passed. Somewhere, a radio played for a few minutes and then went silent. At a little past 11, the yard latch clicked. A figure slipped in, smaller than the man in the shiny hat, moving with the light steps of someone used to going unnoticed. The shape bent over the suitcase, lifted it easily, and turned toward the door. Maigret was already moving. The stairs were narrow, the descent slow enough to keep the boards from creaking. In the yard, the figure had just reached the doorway when he spoke. "You've been careful until now. Why hurry?" The person froze, then half turned. In the faint light from the street, the red hair was unmistakable, though damp now and curling at the ends. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together. "It isn't his," she said. "It never was. You open it and you'll ruin him." "What's in it?" Maigret asked. She shook her head once, sharply, and tried to step past him. He didn't touch her, only stood where the doorway narrowed. The scent reached him then, violets, just as Madame Roche had described. Above them, a window opened quietly, and the shoemaker's voice came down, thin in the night air. "Claire?" The woman looked up, something like regret crossing her face. "You shouldn't have been part of it, Armand." Maigret watched her eyes. They didn't hold guilt the way a thief's might, but they had the strain of someone carrying a weight too long. She set the suitcase down gently, almost respectfully, then slipped past him into the street. He didn't follow. The sound of her footsteps faded quickly. In the yard, the case waited again, as if nothing had happened. But the circle around it was closing, and the people in that circle were beginning to speak. If not to him, then at least to each other. That was enough for now. He lit his pipe in the damp air, the glow briefly touching the brass of the lock, and thought about the woman's words. The case might hold something that could ruin a man, but ruin was not always the same as guilt. Sometimes it was simply the truth left too long unopened. The yard felt emptier once she had gone, as if she had taken some of the tension with her. Yet the suitcase, back in its place, seemed heavier than before. Maigret stood for a while, the smoke from his pipe curling into the damp night, listening for any echo of her footsteps. None came. Only the faint ticking of cooling pipes in the walls and, far away, the murmur of late voices from the café. Above, Jorel still leaned from the window, his face caught between the yellow light of his room and the dark beyond. She is my wife's cousin," he said at last, as though the words had been waiting for years to be spoken. "Claire, she stayed with us for a time after her trouble in Lyon. That was before my wife died." Maigret didn't look up. "And her trouble? It was nothing you could prove," Jorel said too quickly. "Some money missing from a shop. She left before it came to court. And now she's here. She's been here almost a year, helps sometimes in the workshop, polishing. She knows the smell stays on her hands, even after washing." The violet scent, the powder Madame Roche had noticed, the faint trace Maigret had found on the railing. It knitted together quietly, not as proof, but as a pattern. "She says it's not yours," Maigret said. "It isn't," Jorel replied. "But that doesn't mean I know whose it is." In the small apartment, Lognon had been standing at the window, arms folded as if to keep his thoughts from escaping. "You let her walk away," he said flatly when Maigret came in. "Yes," Maigret said, easing into the chair by the table. "It's easier to find someone who isn't hiding, and she won't hide. Not yet." They left the suitcase where it was for the night, the yard door locked again. Maigret slept in the spare room above the shop, the rain returning in the early hours to tap against the shutters. He woke to the smell of coffee, Jorel's, weak and thin, and the sound of the shoemaker moving about downstairs. By 8, the shop was open. The morning brought a trickle of customers, a few curious glances at the stool with its burden, and one delivery boy with a letter for Claire, which Maigret intercepted. The envelope was plain, the handwriting slanted and quick. "Meet me at the footbridge at noon." No signature. "Who would send her this?" Maigret asked. Jorel looked at the paper as if it were in another language. "The man with the hat." "Possibly." He left just before noon, telling Jorel to work as usual. The footbridge was a short walk away, spanning a narrow stretch of the disused freight line that had been turned into a shortcut between streets. It was a place for small meetings, for lovers who didn't wish to be seen, for trades that needed no witnesses. The rain had stopped, leaving the boards slick. She arrived a few minutes late, her hair pinned back but still damp at the ends. She looked around before stepping onto the bridge, and when she saw him leaning at the rail, she stopped, her face unreadable. "You open my letters now?" she asked. "I open whatever walks through this case," Maigret said. She stepped closer, not quite meeting his eyes. "If you want to help him, don't open it. You keep saying that, he said, his voice mild, and you keep not telling me why. It isn't mine, she said, echoing her words from the night before. Number, but you know whose it is. Her jaw tightened. Knowing and proving aren't the same. If you open it, you'll prove something that will destroy him. He hasn't done anything. He was only... there. McGray studied her. And you? She looked away, toward the water-stained wall of a building. I was asked to bring it. That's all. I didn't even know what was inside until I smelled it. The violets, he said. She nodded once. I knew then, and I knew if he saw it, he'd be caught in it. Then why leave it in his shop? She shook her head. It wasn't my choice. He let her go. She crossed the bridge and didn't look back. When he returned to the shop, Longyon was waiting, his expression sour. Our man in the shiny hat was here, asked after a pair of boots that don't exist, looked around like he was measuring the place. Did he touch the case? Number. He barely glanced at it. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but Maigret felt the circle tightening again. The calls, the visits, the letter, all small pressures on the same point. Someone wanted the suitcase left alone, yet they couldn't stop circling it. At closing time, he sent Jorel home and waited in the shop alone. The light outside faded. The sounds of the street thinned. At 7:30, the bell over the door rang. It was Madame Rousseau, carrying a paper bag that smelled of warm bread. I thought you might be hungry, she said. He thanked her, but she lingered, her eyes flicking to the stool. Funny thing, she said. The man with the hat, he's not from here. He's from Gentilly. My sister lives there, near the old tannery. She's seen him with a man who used to run a pawn shop before it closed. Your sister talks much? She listens much, Madame Rousseau said with a small smile. She says the pawn shop man's been looking for something that went missing. Something small enough to carry, but worth more than people expect. After she left, Maigret sat with the bread untouched, thinking of pawn shops and small valuables, of a suitcase left in a shoemaker's shop by someone who didn't want it opened. The connection wasn't complete, but it was close enough to see the shape forming. He went upstairs for the night, the case still on its stool below. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the memory of Claire's voice on the bridge, the sound of the latch in the yard, the faint powder scent that didn't belong to any of them. When he woke before dawn, the shop was quiet. Too quiet. He went down the stairs without turning on the light. The stool was empty. The suitcase was gone. The yard door hung open, the latch broken clean through. On the flagstones, a single shoe print in drying mud led toward the street. Small, narrow, the kind of shoe a woman might wear when she wanted to walk quickly. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the early morning air cool on his face. The game had shifted. They were no longer circling the case. It was out in the open now, in someone's hands. And whoever had it would have to move fast, because the longer they kept it, the more it would weigh on them. Maigret knew then that it wouldn't be long before the truth came to him. It had a way of finding its own path back, no matter how many locks were broken or streets crossed in the rain. Dawn turned the street the color of unpolished pewter. The print on the flagstones dried as Maigret watched it, narrowing at the heel, the forepart scalloped by a worn edge. Cheap leather often walked. He didn't step in it. He stood a little aside, looking past it to the slick pavement beyond, where a faint runnel of water had cut the dirt the way a pencil corrects a line. Whoever had come had not lingered. They had known where the latch would give, where the stool stood, how to lift without scraping. It was almost courtesy. By the time Jorel came downstairs, hair rumpled and face gray from the kind of sleep that never sinks, Maigret had already sent the barber's boy to the market corner and the first tram stop with an instruction. Ask nothing, only look. The shoemaker's gaze went straight to the emptiness on the stool, then to the broken latch, and settled finally on Maigret's face as if that might still contain the missing weight. "You locked it," he said. It wasn't accusation. It sounded like a child reciting a rule. "I did," Maigret said. The boy burst back in before the shop had taken its first breath of morning customers, raincoat flapping, proud of what he knew. At the tram, they saw a woman with a suitcase, he reported without introduction. Early, before the sweeper. Red hair like fox fur, but under a scarf. "Did they see her get off?" Maigret asked. "Gently," the boy said, pleased to have the answer ready. The conductor said she smelled like the big stores. He wrinkled his nose, searching the word. Powder. Maigret put a coin on the counter, and the boy made it vanish. "Home," he told him, "and keep your eyes for hats that shine." He left the shoemaker to the first heels of the day and went on foot. He preferred mornings like this for walking, when the city's edges were softened and people had not yet gathered their disguises. Gentilly lay only a handful of stops away, but the few extra minutes along the rails and over the footbridge were worth the look they gave him at the backs of houses. The poor lace of laundry, the tin of a canary, the small sins on a windowsill. Madame Rousseau's sister kept a bar near the old tannery. When he pushed in, the smell had the sour sweetness that rooms acquire after a long damp. Boiled coffee, old beer, the ghost of hides from another era. She was trimming a loaf with a knife too big for the job, and her eyes flicked to his hat and then to his hands. "My sister talks," she said before he could introduce himself. "I listen." "The man with the shiny hat," he said. "He thinks people see him because his hat is shiny," she replied. "People see him because he stands still in the wrong places." She wiped crumbs with a quick palm. "He sleeps at the boarding house on Rue de Repos, 4th floor under the roof. He owes me for 2 coffees. He's been here with a man who used to keep a pawn shop until he forgot to give receipts. And a woman." Her mouth made a little twist that wasn't quite a smile. "Women come to bars, monsieur, but they don't all come with men." He had coffee that tasted of morning and metal, and went to the boarding house. The stairs were steep, and the banister left a film on his palm. At the 3rd landing, a door opened, then closed. On the 4th, under the roof as promised, he found a room whose door was the kind of door that had been forced often enough to lose its pride. He knocked. The man in the shiny hat opened. Without the street under him, the hat looked more foolish. He didn't take it off. His eyes slid to the right, where a chair stood awkwardly against the wall, as if someone had just vacated it. There was a trace in the air, violets and damp cloth. The bed wasn't made. The blanket had the 2 ridges left by knees pressed hard together. In a corner stood a square shadow that could have been a suitcase if one were thinking of suitcases. Maigret didn't step in. He let the door frame be his border, and his weight be his authority. "You have friends early," he observed. "I am not particular," the man said and tried a tired grin. "Do I owe you for coffee too?" "For something," Maigret said. He looked at the floor. It offered little, a scatter of ash near the window, the mark of a heel on the pine boards, small and narrow, carrying a dark crescent where the leather had been wet and then begun to dry. He took out his pipe. "You didn't sleep with your hat on." The man took it off, surprised by his own compliance, revealing hair pressed flat. "I was going to go out." "Then go," Maigret said, and stepped aside. The man hesitated, felt the joke trap him, then brushed past, hat in hand. In the corridor, his steps lightened as if he had escaped something heavier than a conversation. Maigret went in then. He didn't open drawers. He didn't need to. On the chair where the eyes had gone was a scrap of brown string, cut clean and short, the kind used in shops to tie parcels. On the table, a ticket stub from the first tram into Gentilly, damp at the edge where a thumb had held it too long. Under the window, a scuff against the skirting that might have been made by a case too hurriedly set down. He bent, pressed his thumb to the mark, brought it away and looked at what clung. a film of grey, not dust, but the talc turned paste by rain. He folded his handkerchief around it, put it away, and closed the door with the respect one gives to rooms that aren't finished with their story. The pawn-shop man was easier. He had a name, La Chèvre, and a face like a ledger left too close to a lamp. Dry, crinkled, the edges singed by small economies. He kept an office now that wrapped watches and rings in paper instead of glass cases. He met Maigret with the thin patience of a man who knows his rights, but not how long they will last. "You know a shoemaker in Montrouge?" Maigret asked. "I know shoes," La Chèvre said. "They walk in, they walk out." "And a woman with red hair." "I know hairless," he said. But his gaze flicked just once to the door, as if expecting it to admit someone late. "Something went missing from your old trade," Maigret said. "Small enough to carry, worth more than people expect." "A little book," La Chèvre said after a pause long enough to be noticed. "Addresses, not of ladies, of debtors, men who paid to keep certain items quiet. If you sell such a book to the wrong man, he becomes the right man." "Where would a shoemaker come into that?" Maigret asked. "The wrong man has the right number. The book changes hands in small rooms. Someone needs a place to leave it where a hand can take it that isn't a policeman's." He smiled then, without humor. "A shoemaker's shop is honest space. People's eyes slide off it. And if the wrong woman brings the wrong case to the honest space," Maigret said. "Then your shoemaker is ruined when the policeman opens it," La Chèvre said, with a small, precise pleasure that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with being right. On his way back, he did not hurry. He had the shape now, if not the fibers. A book, or the hint of one. A red-haired woman who was cousin to a wife dead too young, loyal in a crooked way, a man with a shiny hat who did not have the stomach to force a lock. And behind them, men who owed more than money and would pay it with a shopkeeper's ruin if they could. At noon, Madame Rousseau leaned across her counter and gave him what she had saved. "She came back after dawn," she said. "No suitcase." Eyes red. "She bought a coffee and didn't drink it. She jerked her chin toward the barber shop, where the shiny hat bobbed briefly past the door, followed her with his eyes, and then followed air, as some men do. "You heard her speak?" Maigret asked. "She didn't need to," Madame Rousseau said. "Some things say themselves." She reached under the counter and produced a small paper triangle such as cafes fold from the edge of a sugar packet. On it, in a woman's hand, was a telephone number next to the single word. 3. He dialed from the shop with the solemnity of a man calling at a church door. The voice that answered was a woman's, not Claire's, not the soft fear from the earlier calls. This one was level, used to deciding when it would tremble and when it would not. "You have something," she said. "A suitcase," he agreed. "And you have something, perhaps a book." Silence, like a hand laid flat. Then, "Meet me where streets end and names continue." 3. He knew the place, the triangle where Rue des Trois Frères broke its rhythm and gave way to stairs and a rail. He went alone, not because he distrusted Lognon, but because weight is different carried by one. She was already there when he arrived, a woman in her 40s with a neat coat that didn't try too hard. She would have passed in any crowd, as respectable, unremarkable, the kind of woman who can carry secrets because people do not ask her to put them down. In her gloved hand was a paper parcel tied with the same careful string as in the hat man's room. "You will not open it," she said, meaning the case, not the paper. "You will bring it. In return, you will have this, and you will leave the shoemaker alone." He did not take the parcel. He looked at her shoes. Polished, the soles new, no scallop. He looked at the cuff of her glove, a faint dusting there. Not flour, not ash. Powder. The old-fashioned kind. He could smell it when the wind shifted. Violets. "You are careful," he said, "but care leaves crumbs." It leaves safety, she said. For whom? He asked. Her gaze did not flinch. For the ones who still have to live here next week. She nodded toward the paper parcel. You want the book. It has what you need to close rooms that should not be open. Take it, and let the man with the strings and leather keep making shoes. He has already lost enough. And Claire? He asked. She is loyal, she said simply. She has a taste for mistakes, but not for betrayal. He put his hands in his pockets and felt the worn linen of his handkerchief. He thought of La Chèvre's pleasure at truth, of the shiny hat's impatience, of the shoemaker's face when he looked at the empty stool as if at a grave not yet dug. If I take your parcel, he said, who comes to fetch the suitcase next? And from where? No one, she said. You will bring it, and then it will walk again, but not here. He nodded as if to a remark about the weather. They stood side by side a moment, two people who might have been discussing rent or milk. Then he took the parcel, weighing it in his palm. It had the density of secrets, not heavy, but impossible to forget one was holding it. 3 o'clock, she said. Rue du Repos, the yard behind the tannery. He watched her go up the steps, coat neat, heels regular, a woman whose outline would not linger in the memory of a passer-by. When she was gone, he untied one corner of the parcel, not enough to open it, just enough to see that what lay inside was not thick paper but thinner, onion skin, folded small and close. The smell that rose was of old ink and hands that had touched money and fear. Back in Montrouge, he told Jorel only that he would be out for an hour. The shoemaker nodded without asking. His day had taught him that questions did not speed answers. Maigret left the shop door unlocked and the stool bare. He took the path to Gentilly that now felt like a corridor. At the yard behind the tannery, the air had the sweet rot of leather, a smell that could make honesty feel like decay and vice versa. She was there, punctual. So was the man in the shiny hat, 2 steps back, pretending to be part of a world he did not belong to. And, in the deeper shadow, a third shape resolved as the eye adjusted. La Chèvre's, thin and pale, as if the ledgers had returned to claim him. No one reached first. That was the measure of their need for him. He set the suitcase on a crate that might once have held skins and put the paper parcel beside it. No one moved to open either. He did not either. The city was full of objects that were safe only while closed. You have what you wanted, he said to the woman. And I have what I need. What is that? La Chèvre asked, his voice dry as envelopes. That people will not be ruined by other people's accounts, Maigret said. He took the parcel back into his hand and tapped the suitcase once, as one taps a loaf to know if it will keep. Then he lifted it, not heavy, but with that soft weight again, and turned to go. No one followed. They did not dare, not in that triangle of damp walls and old trades. On the way out, he passed the man in the shiny hat, close enough to see the stubble around his mouth and the worry collecting at the corners of his eyes. Buy a different hat, Maigret said, and went back toward the shoemaker's shop, the case in his hand, and the rain starting again, finer than before, like breathing. He did not go upstairs. He put the suitcase once more on the stool and stood a moment. The shop had its old smell again, glue, leather, a hint of coffee too weak to be worth pouring. Jorel came from the back, paused, and looked as if a thing lost had come obedient at last. He raised his eyes to Maigret's, not to the lock. "Will you?" he began. "Not yet," Maigret said. He set the untied parcel on the counter and smoothed the string with the flat of his hand. "This afternoon we will wait as if none of this had happened. You will mend a heel and stitch a seam. You will polish a pair of boots that do not flatter the ankles, and you will say nothing to anyone who asks. And at the end of the day, if the city still wants to know what is in this case more than I want to know, then perhaps we will open it. But I do not think the city wants to know. I think some people want to forget." Outside, the tram bell sounded. The violet smell in the air thinned until it was only memory. Somewhere, beyond the rain, the steps of a woman's shoes kept time on stairs, and the ledger of small wrongs turned a page by itself. The afternoon slid into place without announcing itself. The shop took on that steady hum that work gives a room even when only one pair of hands is moving. The case sat again on its stool. It had come back like a dog that had run off after a noise and returned because the street was larger than its courage. Maigret untied the parcel he had set on the counter, not hurriedly, only as far as he needed to understand it. Onion skin pages, folded tight, their edges bruised by thumbs. Names. Small sums next to some, larger next to others. A few numbers underlined twice, and then a column of dates that did not march but jumped, days that meant nothing until they were placed against the weather and the trams and the way people ate when they had money and when they didn't. He didn't read far. He didn't need to. The handwriting had two speeds, a clerk's quick hand for those who were already trapped, a slower, careful hand where the trap was still being set. He saw Rue Friant twice, but not the shoemaker's name. The lines next to those entries were empty of amounts. Promise rather than payment. He refolded the sheets and slid them into the inner pocket of his coat, where papers sometimes warmed enough to feel like a body. At 1 o'clock, he left the shop to the smell of glue and the metronome of a hammer, and went home to Boulevard Richard Lenoir. Madame Maigret had kept the choucroute from the day before, as he had asked. Not on the stove, but nestling in the oven where the fat softened instead of boiling. She did not ask about the case. He did not tell her about the yard behind the tannery or the woman with the neat coat. They ate in their usual way, the clink of cutlery steady, the window fogging a little from the heat. "There's a powder," she said at one point, thoughtful, not looking at him. "The old-fashioned kind that smells of violets. Department stores used to sell it to ladies who tried on gloves. They dust the inside so the glove slides on. It clings to the cuff if you aren't careful." He smiled without showing his teeth. "You bought gloves you didn't need once." "I bought gloves because my hands were cold," she said. "The powder lasted longer than the gloves." When he rose to go, she added in the voice she used when she had already decided he knew something but would not say it. "If someone tells you not to open a thing, it's often because it is theirs, or because they have given it to someone who will be blamed for it." She wiped her hands on a towel as if the thought had a residue that should not be left around the kitchen. Back in Montrouge, the light had flattened, the sky a sheet of tin. The barber's boy was sweeping again with more interest than the street warranted. Madame Rousseau nodded at him from behind the counter of the café and lifted a hand with 2 fingers extended, as if to say, "2 of them have been around." In the shop, Jorel stood with his back to the window stitching. He looked up when Maigret entered and let his eyes go to the stool, as if to be reassured that his day's difficulty had not wandered off again while he wasn't watching. "You will open it at the prefecture," he said quietly, as if he had come to this decision in the night and only now found the words for it. "If you must. Not here." "Perhaps," Maigret said. He went to the back, lifted the latch, set it down, lifted it again. The wood gave a tired sound. He stood a moment in the little corridor and let the workshop smell be replaced by the faint odor of wet brick. When he returned, a man was standing in the doorway, hat in his hands at last, hair pressed flat by the band. Without the hat, the shiny man was younger. Or rather, one could see the youth he had been before he learned to wait in the wrong places. He had the bruised look of someone who had slept badly and said little. He came forward 2 steps and stopped, his fingers worrying the felt brim as if it might confess for him. "I have to say something," he announced to the air, which did not answer. Then to Maigret, "May I sit?" Maigret nodded toward the chair that always stood too far from the bench. The man sat. He stared at the case as if it were a person who had been asked a question and had chosen not to answer. "They sent me because my face moves when I'm nervous," he said, with a certain bitter pride. "People trust men whose faces move." He looked up at Maigret. "You knew that last night?" It's why you said nothing." Maigret filled his pipe and did not light it. The man watched the steady business of matches and tobacco and tamping as if there were a clue in the way a thumb turned. "It isn't his," he said, jerking his chin toward the shoemaker. "You know that." "Yes. It was supposed to rest here for an hour and then go. The girl, Claire, was to be paid. She was told it was laundry. They always say laundry to women, you know. No one likes to open someone else's laundry." He rubbed at his mouth. She smelled it and understood. She understands smells. Some women do. "The book," Maigret said. The man shook his head. "Number, not the book. Jewelry, mostly. Rings that go back further than the pawns. A brooch that used to be a duke's and became a necklace and then became nothing and then became something again. Watches that remember fathers. Things that make men foolish and women sharp. In a case, they are only objects. In a shoemaker's shop, they are evidence. In his shop, they are a trap." He looked at his hands. "I do not like traps." "And yet," Maigret said. "And yet," the man agreed. He swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered, the way voices do when they have finally arrived at whatever they came for. "There is a woman. You have seen her. She knows the weight of the book because the book sits in her drawer when it is not in her hand. She knows who owes who, and who has compromised himself tying his shoes. She can make a man open a door he would not have opened, and then she can make him forget he opened it. She's not cruel. She is practical. She thought the shoemaker would be the quietest corner." He put the hat back on, then pulled it off again as if it scratched. "I didn't want to place it. I told them the back latch was too easy. They said easy was good." He lifted his head. "You took the parcel. Did you read it?" "I saw enough." "Then you know it's not all. The best names are not written. They are drawn." He traced a small triangle in the air with his forefinger. 3 dots. That's what she puts for some. 3 men who have taken off their rings and put on other things. 3 men who can be called, always, if a door sticks. They do not like to see their own names. They prefer geometry. He had arrived there without noticing he was arriving, and the knowledge that he had told too much came only after. He was a man who had learned to walk softly, but guilt is heavier than footsteps. For a moment, he looked as if he might say he was lying. Then the muscles in his jaw loosened, and the air went out of him a little. It was not dramatic. It was only honest. "I'm tired," he said. "I thought it would be money. I thought I could lift money. Money makes sense." Then she stood there this morning with her hands in her pockets and said, "We will wait. He will bring it back." And he did. He is the obedient sort. He does not know he is obeying because disobedience is not one of his choices. He looked at the shoemaker who was pretending to be busy with a seam so tight it would have held water. "He always counts stitches out loud when he is afraid," the man added, not unkindly. "It is a way to be in charge of something." Maigret said nothing. Silence did not absolve people. It only made the words they chose carry their right weight. After a long half-minute, the man sighed. "You are not arresting me. Not now. You will later. Perhaps, if you keep company with people who draw triangles to name their friends." The man stood. He put the hat back on, this time for real, and it looked no wiser on his head than before. At the door he turned and said, with a kind of surprise that had pity in it, "He really doesn't know." Then he went out into the pale street and did not look back. After he had gone, the shoemaker set down the boot with the carefulness of a man putting a child to bed. "What don't I know?" he asked into the air. He didn't mean Maigret to answer. He meant the air to lie to him a while longer. In the late afternoon, the respectable woman came in. Not as the woman from the yard or the stairs. Not to trade or to argue. She came as a customer. She had a paper parcel with a pair of men's shoes whose soles had cracked along a crease that showed a heavy step. She placed them on the counter and stood with her hands clasped, the way women do when they are certain of their truth. "They will need stitching," she said. Her coat still smelt faintly of powder. Violets. She turned her head slightly and saw the case on the stool and did not let the seeing reach her eyes. "You are busy," she added to Jarrell, a polite apology that moved the air and nothing else. Maigret watched her without the courtesy of looking away. She looked past him, choosing not to see him. It was an art, like embroidery, to go around what could be a knot without catching the thread. She left a name that was probably not hers, and an address that was probably someone else's. When she had gone, the bell over the door trembled long after the glass had stopped moving. "Is she the one?" the shoemaker asked. His voice was very small. He sounded like a man who had found an old photograph with his wife's face in a crowd and was not sure whether the smile was for him or someone just behind him. "She is one of them," Maigret said. He picked up the shoes she had left. The leather was good. The stitching had been done once with skill and then hurried the second time by someone who thought a needle's point could be blunted by speed. Inside the right shoe, along the lining, there was a sprinkle of that same grey paste. He brushed it with his thumb and left the faintest trace on his skin. When evening came, the street thinned. Lamps lit puddles on the pavement. Madame Rousseau put up the shutters of her cafe with the decisive clatter of a woman whose day had been added up and balanced. The barber's boy, last, leaned his broom against his shoulder and looked in to see if anything had become something. "Not yet," Maigret said, almost smiling. He telephoned the prefecture and spoke to a man who always sounded as if he were answering from the end of a corridor just as the door was closing. "Bring it if you like," the man said. "We have too many cases, open and closed." The joke wasn't good, but he had meant to be kind. He did not bring it. He sat another hour. He let the city's noises braid themselves around the room. He thought of the 3 dots the man had drawn in the air. 3 men. The triangle explained part of the parcel. The names, not written. It explained the woman's neatness. It did not explain why she had come in to leave a pair of shoes like a calling card. At 8:30, Claire came. She did not cross the threshold at once, as if the air at the doorway were heavier than outside. She had no powder now. The rain had a way of rinsing away what made women look like something other than the truth of their faces. She looked at the case, and then at Maigret, and then at the shoemaker, and her jaw softened. She went to the counter and put down a small object wrapped in waxed paper. "From Lyon," she said, to no one in particular. "I kept it because I thought keeping made me innocent. It turns out giving does the same." She pushed the paper toward Maigret. Inside was a key, too fine for door locks, too heavy for boxes. Its bit had the strange, delicate teeth that safe makers carve because they like to prove they can. She began to cry then, not loudly, but in that way that makes the face seem to rest at last in its proper place. The shoemaker stood behind the counter with his hands open, palms up, as if the tears were something he could catch and fix with glue. He did not touch her. He did not step closer. He only said her name the way a man says the name of a town he once passed through and never forgot the smell of. "It was supposed to be simple," she said, the words tumbling now because the silence had made room for them. "I was to bring a case from a lady who sells gloves. I was to leave it in a place where no one would look twice at a case. They told me to write a note and put it under the door. They told me when the man came at night, he would take it and no one would know. And then I smelled the violets and I knew it was hers and not mine and not anybody's really. And I thought if they opened it here, it would be him they saw and not the ones who make lists and never sign." She touched the key with a forefinger as if it might be hot. "This opens something that no one wants opened. That is why they keep telling you not to open. That is the only truth I have." She waited for him to say he understood. He did not. Understanding does not hurry confession. It follows it like a coat put on after a draft. He took the key and felt its cut. Where? He asked. She named a street he knew not far from where La Chèvre kept his new ledgers. The building had a courtyard with a fig tree that bore fruit even though the sun almost never hit it. There would be a cellar, there would be a box in that cellar. He could see it as if he had already descended the stairs and put his hand on the cool iron. "We won't open it," he said, meaning the case, meaning the cellar box, meaning the parts of people that are better left in the half-light until they are ready to be brought into day. "Not here." She nodded. It was assent and reprieve and punishment all at once. When she left, the shoemaker moved at last, only enough to lock the door behind her. He turned the key twice, his father's habit, and let his hand rest on the wood after, as if he could feel the heartbeat of the street through it. Maigret sat with the case and the key in the parcel that rustled like dry leaves. He had the sense, which he sometimes had at this point in a thing, that the end would not be a clap of hands, but a settling, the way a blanket falls into the hollow of a chair after someone has risen. He put the key beside the parcel and waited for the city to make its next move. The rain began again, polite as ever, and somewhere very far off, a tram rang as if calling a dog home. Morning thinned into the kind of pale afternoon that makes even good leather look tired. The key sat on the counter beside the parcel as if it had grown there, its teeth catching on the light. Maigret turned it once between his fingers and put it in his pocket with the care one gives to small, sharp things that can make holes where one didn't intend. He told the shoemaker he might be away an hour, and Lognon, who had arrived with the air of a man already put upon by the day, grunted something that could be read as assent. They left the case on the stool where it had learned to wait. The street with the fig tree was narrower than he remembered, and smelled faintly of damp stone and something sweet the sun had never managed to ripen. A concierge in a cardigan buttoned wrong looked up from peeling potatoes in a basin and took him in with a slow glance that reached his hat last. "Cellars?" he asked. "Cellars," she confirmed, as if repeating a diagnosis. The keys on her belt jingled without enthusiasm. Mice, men, old trunks, same family. She led them to a door the color of tobacco and let them in. The descent was slow, the steps worn in the middle as if the years had walked down the same line, agreeing with themselves. The air grew colder by a degree that made breath feel visible even when it was not. Chalk numbers marked the boxes along the wall, and the fig tree pushed a pale root through a crack as if dreaming of somewhere else. At the far corner, where damp had turned the whitewash into a map of forgotten islands, a steel box waited with the patient vanity of things designed to resist. The key went in without fuss. It had the comfortable fit of a word said in its right place. The lock turned with a sound like a cough someone had tried to hide. When the lid lifted, no smell rose, only the colder air of the closed made itself known. He did not rummage. He took what lay on top first, as a sober man eats the bread before the meat, thin folded sheets of onion skin, the same hand he had seen in the parcel, quick on some, careful on others. Under these, a smaller notebook, black, the size that disappears in a pocket. On its first page, 3 dots arranged into a triangle, nothing else. Lognon leaned in, arms folded, his brows making a roof. "You take everything, and we've stolen it," he said in the tone of a man reciting his catechism. "I will take enough," Maigret said. He slipped the black book into his inner pocket, left the loose sheets where they were. Beside the notebook, an envelope lay with too much care in its folding. He opened it. A pawn ticket, the old kind with ornate border, La Chèvre's name once and a rubber stamp twice. The pledge, "Brooch, gold, old mount." The name scratched lightly over the line as if the hand had been shy. Jorel then, beneath, the addition in another ink. "Né Boulard." He felt rather than heard Lognon make a small noise, half derision, half something that might have been pity. "His wife," Lognon said. "If he didn't know, now he will." "He doesn't know," Maigret said. He replaced the ticket where it had lain and took instead a photograph slipped behind it. 3 women, outside a shop window with gloves on padded hands, the kind that pretend not to be waiting. One of them was Claire, her hair too red for the camera to tame. One was a younger woman with a face you wanted to see in movement. The third was the respectable woman with a neat coat, unneat by years, but so composed it made youth around her look like a mistake. Whoever took the photograph had asked for a smile and been refused 3 times. He closed the lid and turned the key back slowly, not as if he were locking something, but as if returning an object to the shape the building knew. The concierge took her potatoes back from the basin with a look that said people always went down and came up with less than they thought. On the street, the fig leaves made a sound like paper being folded. He didn't say anything to Lognon until they were 2 corners away. "You'll tell him?" Lognon asked, because someone had to. "Not yet," Maigret said. They returned by the longer route, which made the city add small hesitations to their pockets. The smell of a soup that had gone a little too long, the sight of a hat in a window not yet priced, the sound of a child learning how to make a skipping rope whistle. In the shop, the afternoon had taken its position as if it had been waiting for them to rejoin it in order to proceed. The case watched them without moving. Jorel looked from their faces to it and back again. "It is time," he said, but he was not asking for time to pass. He was asking for it to stop in the right place. "Soon," Maigret said. He put the black notebook on the bench and opened it at the first blank-looking page. It was full. It took a trick of the eye to see the writing, names made of lines that were not letters, amounts indicated by pricks with a pin. The triangle repeated in a small hand where others, names that were safe to be written, had sums beside them. He turned a page and another. Rue Friand appeared in a line that was not a line. The date next to it was the week before last, not the week just past. Promise rather than payment. Under it, a mark that looked like a careless dot. It was not. It sat exactly where the triangle would have if drawn. 3 men to lift a thing and pass it along to a woman who sold gloves and knew powder as a weather. He closed the book and put it back in his pocket. "We will take a walk," he said to the shoemaker. "Just to the café." In Madame Rousseau's mirror, his hat floated above bottles, and behind it 2 faces that watched themselves to see whether they gave anything away. He ordered beer and did not drink it. The respectable woman came in 3 minutes later as if pushed by a schedule, placed there by the day. She ordered nothing, stood with her gloves in her hand, and looked toward the shop without looking. Then she turned and saw him already watching her in the glass. She didn't start. People who make lists do not start when they are read. "You have been to the cellars," she said when he joined her at the end of the counter where a bowl of matches had been set for men who forgot theirs. "And you have been to places where powder is sold," he said. She glanced at his sleeve where, without being obvious, he had brushed the cuff that afternoon with a finger along the edge of her left glove when she passed the shoes over the counter. The faint grey he had taken into his nail bed was gone now, or only memory. "If you open it here," she said softly, without moving her lips much, "he will stop being the man who mends people's shoes and become the man who had a suitcase. Once people know a phrase about you, they use it until it replaces your name. You put his name on a ticket once," he said. "Or someone did for you." She didn't look surprised. She was sick, she said. He had pride. Pride makes poor men expensive. "And you use that," he said. "I used whatever kept the shop open," she said, and because there was no boasting in it, it was hard to hate her for the way she said it. "I'm not a charitable institution, but I am not a thief either. I buy time and sell it dear. It is what women do who cannot sell anything else. You ask me not to open the case," he said. "I ask you not to open a life," she said, and the words did not tremble in the way the telephone voices had, but they had the same weight. "You have what you need to shut what should be shut." She glanced at the beer he was not drinking. and he can go on counting his stitches. He left her there and went back across to the shop with the feeling of carrying, for a moment, two truths that did not match and never would. The shoemaker stood, needle paused, eyes on the stool. Claire came at the same instant, as if they had rehearsed, and the shiny hat followed at a distance out of habit rather than courage. The shop was full all at once of people who had nothing to buy. Maigret took the case and put it on the counter where the light was thinner and kinder. He did not reach for the lock yet. He held the shoemaker's gaze instead, the way one holds a door steady while someone decides whether to pass. "Whatever is inside," he said, "does not begin here. It ends here only if we let it. There is a way to be finished with a thing without tearing it open. That is also closure." Jarrell swallowed and nodded in a gesture so small it could have been a breath. Claire stood with her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt, as if the cloth might keep her from falling. The man with the hat took off his hat for once. The respectable woman did not enter the shop but stood in the shadow of the doorway across the street, a figure cut out of patience. Maigret took a small brass tag from his pocket, the kind the prefecture used when it took a parcel into custody, and tied it to the handle. He wrote a number on it that meant something to the filing clerk and nothing to the people in the room. Then he put the case back on the stool. It looked suddenly lighter, as if a name given had eased it. "Tomorrow," he said to Lognan, "we take it in, and we will open it in a room where the only people who will know what was inside are those who already knew." "And him?" Lognan nodded at the shoemaker, not unkindly. "He will mend shoes," Maigret said. They left it at that. The evening came on like someone drawing a curtain not quite shut. One by one they drifted into the street, the hat without its man of purpose, the cousin whose mistake had a key in it, the woman who made triangles with dots. Maigret stayed until the last shoe was put on a shelf and the last latch tested twice. When the door was locked, he walked with the shoemaker to the corner without speaking. At the tram rails he said, "She pawned the brooch because she wouldn't ask. That is all you need to know." The man stopped, lifted his face a little to the thin rain, and closed his eyes. It wasn't relief. It was what people do when a line is drawn across a page they have been afraid to look at. "Thank you," he said, and because he was a man who did not waste words, the two were heavy enough to carry between them until they fell away quietly of their own accord. Maigret did not go directly home. He walked to the river because water had a way of making city noises agree with each other. On the Pont d'Austerlitz, the wind had collected a smell of damp paper and iron. He thought of the notebook against his chest, of the triangle that made names unnecessary, of the way a department store's glove powder could mark the cuff of a woman who did not believe in leaving traces, and yet left them everywhere because she had lived a life in which she was always brushed by other people's needs. He thought of the case on the stool and of how sometimes not opening a thing was the only way to see it rightly. At home, Madame Maigret had left his plate covered and a note that asked whether he would prefer beer or tea. He chose tea because the day had been made of too many small fires. Before sleeping, he took the black notebook from his coat and put it in the drawer with his socks, as if to remind it that it belonged now with ordinary things. The rain, which had been polite all day, grew fractionally less so. Somewhere, a telephone would ring in the morning with a voice that had decided to tremble again. Or not. He let the thought sit at the edge of his mind, the way a suitcase sits in a room when it isn't yours. Then he went to bed and lay on his side, listening to the small tick of cooling pipes and thinking of a fig tree whose roots kept their own counsel underground. Morning didn't so much arrive as take the place of night without changing the light. He rose with the heaviness that comes after a day in which nothing has quite happened, and yet something has altered everything. He put the black notebook in his inside pocket as he would a wallet and took the suitcase by its handle, feeling again that soft, deceitful weight. At the prefecture, the corridors had their peculiar echo, made from shoes that hurried and voices that didn't. A clerk with a mustache too neat for his face, took the brass tag number as if it were a favor. Lognon joined him in a room that had a table and a chair and an enamel jug of water, and nothing else to confuse a man's attention. "Now," Lognon said, making it both question and complaint. "Now," Maigret said. He did not dramatize opening it. He set it flat and pushed the lock with his thumb. It yielded with a small consent. The smell that rose was not rot or oil or anything a man can name. It was the colder air of something that had kept itself to itself. On top lay a folded scarf, the color of gingham washed too often, and a powder lingered in it that someone who had never been to a glove counter would not have recognized. Beneath, 2 narrow boxes, the kind that once held cufflinks or brooches, one empty, the other with a brooch mount, the stones gone, the prongs bent as if anger had tried to put back what pride had taken out. 2 watches without covers lay side by side like eyes that had stopped seeing. The numbers had been filed from their movements in a way that made the filing almost more intimate than the number. At the bottom was an envelope folded with that too careful care that says the hand that folded it had more time than it wanted. He opened it. Pawn tickets old, some with rubber stamps twice over. A slip with Lachèvre's flourish, a smaller torn paper with a name written hard at first, and then gone weak at the end. Jorel. Underneath, in another hand, the correction that had tried to be kind by being exact, Né Boulard. In the corner of the envelope, a smear of violet powder like a secret pudding on its face. Lognon leaned back and let the air go out of him with a thin sound. "You were right not to do this in his shop," he said. "He would have worn this for years." "It would have replaced his name," Maigret said. He closed the case and wrote a line on a form without looking at the words as he wrote them. He left the watches and the boxes and the scarf on the table with the folded paper. He put the envelope with the tickets back inside and kept one. The brooches. He placed the empty mount next to it with the tenderness of someone putting a lost button on a saucer so it won't roll. The black book stayed in his pocket. He did not sign the case over to evidence until the clerk had agreed to a room with fewer ears than usual. Some tasks are better done where the building forgets who walked there. He found Lachèvre at his desk with the posture of a man who has decided to be reasonable because indignation costs more. He didn't show him the watches or the boxes. He opened the black notebook to a random page and turned it so the man could see the triangle drawn with 3 dots and no lines. For a second, something happened to Lachèvre's mouth, the way a crack shows in a dry field when a foot steps on it. He had the decency not to laugh. "You always think you've invented a cipher," he said, and then a policeman puts his finger on it and calls it by its proper name. "What is its proper name?" Maigret asked, as if it were a matter of grammar. "Comfort," Lachèvre said with the peculiar venom reserved for things that have done a man more good than harm. "No signatures, only understanding. 3 men who are not friends and cannot be seen together, but who will lift a thing when it is heavy and put it down where a woman can carry it without being stopped. The triangle has no center, which is why it works." "And the woman with the gloves?" "She sells time," Lachèvre said. "I sold shame. We all sell what we have a supply of." "You used the shop," Maigret said. "We used anything that wasn't ours," he said. "That is also a kind of honesty." He knew as he said it that he had confessed as much as a man of his temperament confesses. Men who keep ledgers do not believe that the right line is ever in the wrong place. They only regret when the ink runs. When Maigret left, he could feel behind him the small stiffness of a man not used to being relieved. Some arrests are not made in rooms. They are made by a man walking away, with the thing that kept another man upright. He wanted to put off the respectable woman for half an hour, and found he could not. He went to the section of street where the glove counters show their false pale hands under glass, and then beyond, to the boarding-house room she used sometimes in the afternoons. Pride keeps its appointments. She opened at once and did not invite him in. He stepped past her anyway and touched the cuff of his sleeve to the edge of her glove, without making a theater of it. The faint dust remained there less than a minute, and then was gone, as if even powder had learned not to linger where policemen put their arms. "I will not take you in, today," he said. "Not because you owe me anything. Because there is a shop where people bring shoes the way they take breath. It is a fragile thing, breath. It stops when you put it under glass." "And tomorrow?" she asked. She did not argue. She did not plead. Her hands were still. "Tomorrow you will have to decide what to be without the triangles," he said. "You are clever enough to do it. Cleverness and decency are not enemies. They simply do not meet often." She thought about it a moment, and in that thinking he saw the person she was when she lay awake at night listening to her own arguments and finding them insufficient. "People like you always say decency, as if it were a bench," she said quietly. "Something you sit on while other people pass. It is not a bench. It is a tax. I pay it every day." He nodded because he had no reason to call her a liar. On his way out, she lifted a box lid, and for the first time in 2 days, he saw her hand shake. Only the tiniest hesitation, like a stitch catching in cloth and then releasing. He took the brooch mount and the ticket to Montrouge, the case left behind in a room where it would be seen by as few eyes as possible. The shoemaker looked up when he came in, not at his face, but at his hands. It is a wisdom men who work with their hands have, to read a man's day from what he brings back or doesn't. "You did it," he said, and then, because he was not sure what it was, he added, "whatever it was." Maigret put the mount on the counter and set the ticket beside it, turning the paper so the name faced the man who had once loved the woman who had signed it. The long muscles in the shoemaker's cheeks tightened and then let go. He took the mount not as evidence, not even as memory, but as if it had heat in it and would burn if held too long. "She did not tell me," he said at last, and said it not in reproach, but as a man states a condition of weather. She would starve rather than ask. "She did not starve," Maigret said. "She only had pride. It is worse on the stomach than hunger, but it looks better on the face." He waited for tears, and there were none. The shoemaker was not made of water. He was made of leather and string and small neat motions that kept men like him from coming apart in places that can't be mended. He put the mount in the drawer where he kept new needles and his father's knife, and he closed the drawer very slowly as if that might make the space inside behave properly. Claire came later, in the lull between the afternoon's clatter and the evening's quieting. She stood with her hands under her elbows like a child who has been told not to touch a display. She looked at the counter, the mark where a wet parcel had once left a stain, the scar in the wood from an awl dropped and caught in time, the place where the mount had rested until it was put where it belonged. "I telephoned that night," she said, almost to herself. "I thought if I said it not to him but to you, it would count." "It counted," Maigret said. "I am tired of mistakes," she said. It was not drama. It was just tiredness finding the right sentence. The man with the hat stood for a time outside under the awning and then came in with the hat off and asked for a pair of laces he did not need. It was the way men like him say they are sorry, by paying for something small with money that might have bought them a drink. He looked at the drawer, not knowing why, and then looked away. He left with the laces in his pocket and the habit that had kept him in the wrong places already slightly weakened by the knowledge that there were other doors. Before closing, Madame Rousseau brought in a folded piece of paper like a schoolchild's exercise, the kind that spends half a day under a sugar bowl before anyone remembers what it is. "He left this," she said. "The shiny hat. He said he can't read his own writing in the evenings." On it was an address and a time, and under that, 3 dots and a line drawn not quite straight, as if the hand had trembled at last. He would not be there when the time came. It didn't matter. The line was the thing. Men who think themselves geometry are always undone by the moment they become line and not shape. At the river later, Maigret watched the water carry away the day's smell. Powder, glue, the sweet, faint rot near the tannery. He phoned the prefecture from a kiosk and said only that there should be 2 men at the corner of Rue de Repos at 9, and another in the passage 3 streets away at 1:15, and that papers with small dots are best collected when women are not made to watch. He didn't use names. He had learned that sometimes a city obeys better when it is not told what it already knows. On the boulevard, lights came on in windows where dinners were being laid in plates that did not match. He thought of the woman with the gloves powdering the inside because customers liked things that slid. He thought of Lachèvre's ledger-dry voice and the way he had said comfort as if it were a vice. He thought of the shoemaker counting stitches when he was afraid. He thought of Madame Maigret saying decency wasn't a bench, and of how right she would be to scold him for bringing the smell of glove powder into the house. When he reached home, she was knitting with the steady click that has nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with keeping the center of a day intact. He sat. She did not ask. He did not tell. There is a kind of intimacy made of not asking and not telling that some marriages are built to carry. He slept, and in the morning the telephone did not ring at first. He went to the window and looked at the street the way a man looks at the page of a book he has put down mid-chapter, finding again the last line he remembers. The call came while he was buttering bread. A voice from the prefecture that always grew smaller down a corridor said, "We have them. Not the woman, the others. Would you like to hear names?" He said he would prefer times. The man told him times. They fitted into the afternoon with the logic of rain, inconvenient but unsurprising. He took his coat and went out. On Rue Frion, the bell above the shoemaker's door announced him with the tiny immodesty that all bells have. The case was not on the stool. It would not be again. The stool looked relieved, as if objects could know what they had been near and what they had escaped. "Did you open it?" Jurel asked, not with curiosity now, but the way a man asks whether a tooth has been pulled so that the ache that remains will have a proper name. "In a room where only men who already knew watched," Maigret said. "It was the wrong box. The right one was underground." "And now?" "Now you will mend shoes," he said. "And if the woman with the gloves comes, you will take her parcel and tell her the seams are fine. If she pays, you will give change. If she doesn't, you will say nothing. Some accounts close by not being opened." When he left, the rain had made up its mind and was falling with enough conviction to wash powder even from cuffs that had held it for days. He went to meet a gentleman with too perfect hair who believed important men are not named. He went to watch Lognon stand with his collar up and call it duty. He went to a cafe where the zinc would keep its heat under a saucer for the time it took a woman to decide she would not ask to be forgiven but would permit herself to be tired. He went where the day asked him to go, steps that felt as ordinary as the smell of leather in a small shop. He knew, as one knows about weather, that the end would not be an arrest in headlines, but a quietness in rooms. The shoemaker would look at his drawer and shut it more often with a hand that didn't hurry. Claire would bind her mistakes to her sleep and wake lighter. The man with the hat would buy another if he could stand his own uncovered face. The woman with the gloves would count what she had and what she did not, and the triangles would become angles without meeting. And he, who had not opened a thing where it would have ruined a name, would finish the day as he liked best, with a cup that had been warmed and a window a little fogged, and the sound of rain making even the careless careful. The rain changed its mind twice before midday, and then settled into a fall so light that it seemed to rise from the stones instead of dropping from the sky. He spent the morning in rooms where paper is heavier than people and where men bring coffee they do not drink. There were statements that avoided verbs and dates that pretended not to know each other. The black notebook lay in his inside pocket as if it were a small animal that had learned to be still. Names that had been dots became lines. Lines became walks to doors. doors opened because a clerk with a mustache put a form on the right pile. Long Nyon went about with his collar up and a pencil behind his ear, and the air of someone who has been given exactly the amount of work he expected and will resent it precisely that much. By early afternoon they had the triangle's corners in chairs. They did not look at one another. Men who share a geometry without sharing a table keep their eyes on the floor. One of them, the one with the good hair, spoke about trade as if the word explained sin and forgave it in the same breath. Another had hands that kept smoothing an invisible cloth, the hands of someone used to lifting things other people could not see. The third tried to be offended and ended only attired. None of them said the glove woman's name. None of them had to. The room smelt of damp wool and a trace of powder that must have come from someone's sleeve and that now floated with the dust where sunlight did not reach. He left them to their arithmetic and took a tram that moved as if it had been told to be discreet. He got off 3 stops early, not because he wished to walk, but because he wanted the city to fit him back into itself in smaller pieces. At Boulevard Richard Lenoir, he ate what Madame Maigret put before him and waited for the one remark she would make that would place the day on its feet. "You've brought home the smell of drawers," she said, sniffing the air when she took his coat. "Not our drawers, other people's." She folded the coat with a firmness that was not reproach. "You will give her away to walk out of it?" "Whom?" "The woman who makes lists," she said. "If you don't, she will make them again and pretend she doesn't. People repeat themselves when they are not shown a turn in the road." He looked at her, then the way he does when he knows she has been right longer than he has. She poured tea without looking away from the pot. "Leave the men to the papers. They like papers. They will think something has been done because ink exists. Go where the powder is sold." He found the glove counter the way one finds a smell from childhood, by turning after the second column of light and going past a display of hats that looked surprised to be indoors. Hands lay under glass, wax white, wearing gloves the color of milk and of smoke and of cinnamon. Behind the counter, the respectable woman's mouth made the shape it made when she counted and when she lied. A careful line, the kind seamstresses draw in chalk before the cut. She saw him and finished serving a customer as if he were another pair of hands on a velvet cushion. "You cannot buy me," she said quietly when he stepped aside with her into that little aisle the departments have for shame. "You can only make me cheaper." "I'm not buying," he said. "I'm spending. Time, yours. You will come with me and we will walk a short street together and you will not have powder on your gloves when we arrive." Her eyes flicked to his sleeve and back. Pride hesitated at the edge of a word and then did not fall in. "If you arrest me, you make a story. He will be that story. If you don't, I am still a story. He will be in it anyway." "We will not make a story," he said. "We will make a change in habit." She laughed once without sound. Habits are the last things that change. They walked down the stairway between departments where the lights always hum. On the street, the rain had thinned to dots that clung to the cuffs of men who did not notice. She kept her head level. When they reached Rue Friant, she stopped 3 doors from the shop and stood under the awning as if it were a confessional. "Tell me what you want," she said. "You will bring shoes and nothing else," he said. "You will speak about soles and leather and time and never about names. You will pay in coins that do not have numbers written beside them in small books. When a man with good hair sends a boy to ask whether a package can be left on a stool, you will tell him your counter is closed. You will find work that uses your cleverness for things people can see. If you bring powder into a room again, it will be to make gloves slide, not to leave a trace. And if I don't, you will be surprised by how many benches decency has," he said, and the slight humor in his voice wasn't unkind. "You will sit on all of them, one by one." She looked past him, through the shop window, where Jorel bent over a boot as if he were reading a line he had loved once and forgotten and was happy to find again. "He mends well," she said. "I thought, if a life could be mended the way a soul is. Fresh thread, a new piece of leather, a little glue. You could sell it. People would come with their days, and you would give them back with the creak taken out. You can take the creak out of a shoe, he said. You cannot take it out of the person who wore it. She nodded, and for the first time he saw her without the counter, without the parcel, without the useful lies people were willing to buy. She became a woman who had been practical too long. I will not come back, she said. You will come back, he corrected gently. But you will buy your gloves elsewhere. That is already a kind of reform. He left her with the awning and the decision, which are cousins, and went into the shop. Claire came from the back, with her sleeves rolled and a streak of polish on her wrist. She looked less red around the eyes and more what she must have been before Lion. The person who tidies a counter because it is untidy, not because someone has told her to. The man with the hat stood in the doorway with a hat he had bought from a window that believed in daylight. It was less shiny, and he kept fidgeting with it because honesty itched. We are closing, Jorel said to no one in particular, though the clock said it was early. I promised myself I would go somewhere I ought to have gone a long time ago. He wrapped a small thing in brown paper with movements so gentle that even the paper chose not to crackle. He put it in his pocket and wiped his hands more than once on a rag that had seen better rags. He looked at Maigret, not to ask permission, but as men look at a constable when crossing a street at a bad angle, to be told if the angle is really bad. Yes, Maigret said. They walked together up the hill to where the gates are open all day, and then at night become more open by being closed. The cemetery paths were wet but not unfriendly. Gravel made the sound gravel makes when it agrees with shoes. They found the row because people who aren't rich do not have complicated rows. Her name was there with the dates that made a life appear smaller than it had been. Jorel stood with his hat in his hands, and because the day was what it was, there was no one to watch him be something other than a shoemaker. He took the brooch mount out and set it on the stone, not like an offering. That is a word for people who want to be seen, but like a tool laid down at the end of a day. He didn't speak. He had the decency to let the quiet do his work for him. After a while, he put the mount back in his pocket and touched the stone with his forefinger exactly where the surname met the first name, as if to stitch them together. Thank you, he said to the air. It was not to Maigret. The air accepted it the way it accepts rain. On the way back down, Claire slipped her arm through his for half a street and then took it away, embarrassed by the thing she had done that was not a mistake. At the corner, she stopped and turned to Maigret with a look that asked for nothing and yet somehow did. Do you think I can be better if I do not go anywhere? She asked. You can be better by staying and by leaving, he said. People think either or, because it is easier to draw. It is often both. I might go to Dijon, she said, for a week, to tell my niece that Lion is behind us and in front of us. Write a postcard from the market, he said. Say the fruit looks honest. They smiled in that brief, awkward way that belongs to people who will not see each other often and are lucky for it. She left them at the tram with a wave that didn't rise above her shoulder. The man with the new hat trailed 2 paces behind her, not following, only learning how to walk in a world where a policeman had told him to buy a different brim. Evening came without the rain needing to change. He stood a while under Madame Rousseau's zinc, watching the room square itself to the night. The bottle necks in their row, the glass where someone had made a circle with a damp base and not wiped it. The matches in their bowl as exact as soldiers imagined by a boy. She brought him a beer he did not have to ask for. Is it finished? She said. It has stopped, he said. That is not the same thing, she said. No, he agreed. But it is the beginning of the same thing. She nodded. The sister in Gentili says they took 2 men who didn't look surprised and one who looked grateful. She also says the lady with the gloves has been buying plain ones. That will not suit her, he said. It will not kill her either, she replied, wiping the counter with a cloth that smelt faintly of lemon. He left the cafe when the lights from the apartments became squares of yellow that reminded him of the little forms the clerk filled. At home, the apartment had its warmth without needing to show it. Madame Maigret had left a plate under a bowl and a note that said the butcher had had a good day and so would they. He sat with his socks drawer open for a minute longer than he needed to, looking at the place where the black notebook had been and where socks had conquered again. He closed it and felt, in the click, a satisfaction out of proportion with the action. The telephone rang once, twice, then stopped, then rang again as if remembering its lines. It was a voice from the corridor saying that papers had been signed and that the city would be a little safer for a few weeks, in a way no one would notice. He said that would do. He put the receiver down and stood a moment with his hand on the bake light, the way he does when he thanks an object for having played its part. Before sleep, he went to the window. The street had the peacefulness of shoes taken off and placed beside a bed. Somewhere, a woman laughed and then coughed. Somewhere, a boy ran late and decided not to. He thought of the suitcase, not opened where it would have turned a man into a phrase, of a key whose teeth had fit because someone had meant them to, of powder that, under rain, becomes paste and then dust and then nothing. He thought of 3 dots that once made a triangle and had been separated into points that would not meet for a while. He thought of a shop in Montrouge whose door would be locked twice and whose bell would still make the same small sound in the morning. He filled his pipe and didn't light it. The room smelt mildly of tobacco that might be and of rain that was. He closed the window and let the city finish speaking to itself without him. By the end of the week, the city had already begun to forget the shape of the affair as cities do. The small column in the evening paper spoke of a brokerage of valuables and discreet recoveries, the kind of phrases that make readers think of other people's lives. Names were not printed. They rarely are when the names are not the story. At the prefecture, the black notebook was registered and then put in a drawer where drawers keep other drawers company. The 3 men who had preferred geometry to signatures were led along corridors that smelled of ink and cold iron. They did not look at one another, and when a clerk told them to sit, they sat in 3 chairs that did not touch. La Chèvre, tidy as ever in defeat, asked for a pen as if he were still the man who moved other men's losses from one page to another. The respectable woman came in once, not to be charged, but to be listened to. She left with her hands empty and her gloves in a paper sleeve. When she passed Maigret in the hall, she nodded with the politeness people keep for priests and doctors, and those who can make trouble stop without healing it. He went back to Montrouge on a morning that had remembered how to be grey. The shop was open, the bell giving its discreet tinkle and then forgetting it at once. The stool that had carried the suitcase now carried a pair of children's boots turned upside down to dry. The mark the case had left on the counter had thinned until it could have been a shadow misplaced. The air had gone back to smelling of leather, glue and the faint bitterness of coffee that had cooled in a small pan on the stove behind the curtain. Jurel raised his head and then lowered it again, not out of rudeness, but because he knew with some men it was better to look at the thing that had brought them together than at the man himself. He finished the stitch he was tying and clipped the thread. "You have been busy," he said, as if making conversation about the weather. "We have all been busy," Maigret said. They did not speak of brooch mounts or pawn tickets or the neat black book that had lay quiet in his pocket like a small obedient animal and now lay quiet somewhere else. Maigret put a postcard on the counter, face down. The picture showed a market stall with bright fruit turned to the camera like faces. On the back was a line in a hand that had tried for steadiness and nearly managed it. "The fruit looks honest. See." The shoemaker read it and let his thumb rest a moment on the corner, as if paper could carry warmth. "Dijon," he said. "Only for a week." "A week is time enough to begin a habit," Maigret said, "and not long enough to make a mistake of it." The man with the new hat came in while they were speaking and bought laces he did not need. He had not yet learned what to do with his hands when they did not hold other people's errands. He paid with coins that had been earned in hours rather than in corners, and when he left, he pushed the door with his shoulder and not with his back, as if he had decided he did not need to keep the street out with his spine. Across the way, Madame Rousseau stood under her awning and rubbed the zinc counter with a cloth until the marks left by damp glasses made sense again. She came over later with a baguette wrapped in paper and said the sister in Gentilly had reported that 2 men had gone very quietly and one had tried to say something and thought better of it. They don't always take the one you expect, she said. Sometimes they take the one who breathes wrong when names are said. She added that the woman who sold gloves had bought plain ones, a remark that made her mouth pinch and her eyes soften at the same time. In the afternoon, when the sky brightened, without meaning it, the respectable woman appeared at the door of the shop as a customer again. She set a pair of men's shoes on the counter, whose heels had worn in the outward way that comes from pride or heavy hips. Her coat was neat, and there was no powder on the cuff. She stood perfectly still while Jarrell examined the stitching, and when he told her what it would cost, she reached into a purse and counted coins that were neither too many nor too few. She did not look at Maigret. As she left, she stopped, considered, and then said without turning her head, "It is not easy to sell only what one can show." She was not asking for an answer, and he did not give one. Longnon came in just before closing to say that a magistrate had asked for cooperation and prudence, and that both had been promised. He stood with his collar up and his hands deep in his pockets as if the day were a wind. "They'll get a year or less, maybe more. It depends on whether the papers wish to be respected or read." He snorted, then added, not ungenerously, "Your shoemaker will be left alone." "He will be left as he was," Maigret said. "That is better than most men manage." They locked the door at 6. Jarrell turned the key twice, the way his father had shown him, and let his hand rest on the wood a fraction of a second longer than necessary. They walked together as far as the corner. The street was the kind that keeps its own counsel. "My wife wouldn't have told me," the shoemaker said, with the flat acceptance of a man who has thought the thought until it no longer stings. "Not because she didn't trust me, because she had decided not to need me." "Pride is sometimes a polite word for fear," Maigret said. "It eats the same." The shoemaker nodded. He lifted his hat a few centimeters and put it back, like a man practicing a courtesy he had no one left to extend it to. "You didn't open it in my shop," he said. "I have thought about that. I think I will still be able to make shoes." "That is the idea," Maigret said. He did not go straight home. He took the tram to the river and walked a little on the quay where the smell of damp paper and iron collects in the late afternoon. It was not yet cold and not yet warm. He stood with his hands in his pockets and watched the grey water learn again the shape of the bridges and of itself. He thought of the suitcase, which belonged to no one and everyone, because that is what such objects are. Of the black notebook that had taught him once more that names have more ways of being written than letters will admit. Of the woman who had sold time at the price it would bear and would now be obliged to find other merchandise. Of a man who had worn a shiny hat to feel like someone and had discovered a different weight for his head. He went home for supper. Madame Maigret set the table with the bread she had bought and the little dish of mustard he liked when he pretended he did not. She did not ask questions, but she pushed the sugar toward him when he took his coffee, because she had decided the day had included too much bitterness already. "You've lost the smell," she said, sniffing lightly as he hung his coat. "Of drawers. Perhaps the rain took it." "It rains where it is needed," he said. "Sometimes." After they ate, he took the black notebook from the drawer where socks had reclaimed their place and set it on the table. He did not open it. He only touched the cover with his fingers, as if to assure himself that it could belong to furniture, not only to crimes. "If you write names," he said, more to himself than to her, "you should sign your own first." "And if you cannot?" she asked. Then you learn to live without paper, he said. It is not so terrible. They drank in silence. The apartment held the comfortable noises that things make when they have been in the same place a long time. The small tick from the pipe when it cools, the sigh of wood behind a cupboard door, the soft, persistent claim of water in the pipes, like a cat reminding a house it exists. Outside, the rain was the kind that keeps to the edges of windows. A day later, a parcel arrived at the prefecture, wrapped in brown paper and tied with the careful string he had seen already too often. Inside was a glove box with a pair of plain gloves and nothing else. No note. He thought of the woman's remark, habits being the last things to change, and allowed himself to be surprised that sometimes last happens sooner than expected. He put the box aside and did not write anything about it. He went once more to Rue Friand. It was a Saturday, the sort of day when people remember small repairs they have put off for a season. The shop was busy in its quiet way. A young man brought a broken buckle and stood uncertainly before the counter, as if his shoes and his future were connected. A woman with a shopping basket asked whether a stain could be made to go where people do not see. A postman left a laugh behind him when he pushed the door with his shoulder. The boots on the stool had been replaced by a pair of half-boots for ankles that needed kindness. There was no powder in the air. It smelled of polish and leather and something like contentment. Claire had returned from Dijon. She came in later with a jar of mustard wrapped in newspaper and hands that had been kissed by a niece for the first time in months. She said no one had asked her about Lyon, which was better than she had hoped for, and that the fruit had been as honest as promised. She took her place behind the counter without ceremony and began to polish a pair of shoes that did not need polish, half as much as she needed the movement. The man with the new hat held the door and let it close slowly behind him, as if he had learned that doors have their own pace. When he said goodbye, the shoemaker put down his awl and looked up with his eyes as if he were measuring an opening only he could see. "You have left me with the same life," he said. "I am grateful." It was the best thing a man like him could say, and Maigret took it as it was given. On his way back to the tram, he stopped at the café. Madame Rousseau poured him beer without being asked, and said the sister in Gentilly had sent word that the boarding house under the roof had a new tenant who did not owe anyone for coffee yet. "It is almost a success," she said, tilting her head to see how he would take the word. "It will do," he said. He walked to the stop and stood under the shelter with a handful of other people who had learned patience the way city people do, by being asked for it too often. Somewhere, a clock struck the half-hour without any church to belong to. He thought, as he often did at the end of a matter, not of guilt or innocence, but of weight, the soft weight of a suitcase, the greater weight of a name that could have been replaced by a phrase, the small weight of a postcard that could steady a day. The tram came, and he climbed aboard, and the driver nodded at him the way men nod at a face they do not know, but trust to behave. He did not look back. It was not necessary. The shop would be there tomorrow, with the bell that made its small sound, and the latch that yielded after 2 turns, and the rain would find its level. He thought of his pipe, unlit on the table at home, and of a window that would fog a little with the heat of supper. He sat, and the city slid by, and nothing in it asked to be opened, 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 asked to be